with sensing and intuition, 70% of people are sensors and only 30% are intuitives. And this is interesting because if you think about marketing, most marketing is really geared towards pointing towards the future and wanting to help people think outside of the box. But when you recognize that 70% of the population are sensors, that means there's a majority of people who are kind of comfortable with the way things are or the way things have been, or are maybe a little bit resistant to change. And so that
Welcome to the Brands That Book Show, where we help creative businesses find more clients and build their brands. I'm your host, Davey Jones, and today we're chatting with Elisa Watson. She is the co-founder of the drag and drop website building platform Showit, and she's also a personality expert. Today she's chatting with us about the various personality types and how having an understanding of your personality can lead to better relationships. So let's get started.
All right.
Cool. All right, so to give people a little bit of background, I met Elisa at a Giant retreat, and Giant puts on these. I don't even know how to explain it. How would I explain this?
Leadership training retreats.
Yeah, they do a leadership training program, and it lasts over the course of a year, and there's 4 retreats, and so when you go, you get put in different groups, and so me and you, we were put in a group together, and that's when I met you for the first time and was able to get to know you through the course of the year.
Yeah.
And, one thing I noticed really quickly was that you were always so slow to speak. But every time you did speak, you were super articulate.
Mm-hmm.
And I always admired that about you. And I think that anybody who's been to Showit United and sort of the last 2 years, you've given, an opening talk. And I think that's something that other people realize right away is, oh, wow, everything, even that talk, it's not super long, but it's jam-packed of just good stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And even beyond that, especially around personalities and personality tests and learning about oneself, you always seem to be able to take it that much deeper. So I'm excited to talk to you about all the different personality tests out there and pick your brain about a couple things. I've always been bad about trying to make that kind of stuff practical in my life.
Yeah.
So I'm excited to explore some of that stuff with you.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Thank you for that intro. I'm really excited to be here and to talk about it.
Yeah. So you are a co-owner of Showit, and you do a lot of this kind of stuff with the Showit team, right? So kind of on maybe a monthly or quarterly basis, you meet with them and you kind of talk over, personality types and stuff.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. I think that personally, the personality stuff, I enjoy it most in terms of how it applies to relationships. So I think it has a lot of value for husbands and wives to know, for parents to know about their kids, but that definitely translates to the workplace also. I think it has a lot of application in our office interactions and relationships, and then even in terms of how people think about their job and their role and how that kind of fits into the bigger picture of a company.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think it has a lot of application.
How did you become interested in general? Because I feel like, it's always interesting to learn a little bit about yourself, and I always enjoy going and taking the personality types, but you always seem to, be able to take it deeper. Whatever we were learning at Giant, you always, you understood, I think the different nuances between the different personality types.
Yeah. Yeah, well, my parents have always really enjoyed these kinds of conversations and this topic. And I remember when I was in 6th grade, I took a Myers-Briggs personality test at school. They had us all do it just kind of for fun. And that was the first time I'd ever heard about it. But when I brought my results home, my parents right away knew what I was talking about. And they both knew their personality type. And so over the years, we kind of would occasionally have conversations about this. And so it had always sort of been on the periphery for me, like something I was familiar or, sort of vaguely familiar with for a long time. And then in the months leading up to going to Giant for the first time, Todd, my husband, and I had been talking about that a little bit more and seeing the value possibly in sharing it with our team and kind of exploring it in the workplace too. So at that point, I started studying it more in depth, but I feel like I've sort of grown up around conversations about personality and self-assessment. And my sister's always been very knowledgeable about this stuff too. So we've had a lot of fun conversations. And I have a good friend who I actually do a podcast with. And we talk a lot about personality on there. It's always been sort of a hobby of hers too. So I've just been around it. I've always enjoyed it.
Yeah, and we'll definitely link to that podcast in the show notes. And a large part of that podcast is talking about, personality types, signs of life, SINES, instead of SIGNS. And we'll go into why here in a second. So what are the kinds of things that you do with the Showit team, to help them work better together and relate better?
Yeah. Well, the fact of the matter is most people struggle when it comes to self-assessment. It's not something that comes super easily or naturally for most people. And so I think that one of the most valuable things about these personality tools is that it gives you sort of a framework for how to self-assess. And I think that's so important in terms of being successful. And so with the team, we've just kind of taken the Myers-Briggs mostly. We haven't talked about the other personality tests over in that context, but with Myers-Briggs, we've sort of looked at each piece of personality and what that means and what that looks like. And like recently we've been breaking into groups and having conversations about, what it means to be an introvert, what it means to be an extrovert, and kind of having conversations with each other and helping each other understand what that looks like. And we've had a few conversations over the years or over the months about, how that can apply these concepts even to marketing mindsets and things like that too. But like you said, once a month these days, we're getting together and just kind of looking at a different piece of that. Yeah,
that's awesome. So speaking of self-awareness and self-reporting, even with a personality test, one thing that I really struggle with is I think I project what I would rather be like, so you get the scope, on any given test, like, I guess, which one do you relate to the best or which one describes you the best? And I would love to be the early riser, quick to work, that sort of guy. And so sometimes I find myself a little bit, maybe almost cheating, like just projecting like, hey, I wish I was this person. So I select that one.
Yeah.
Do you have any tips on like completing those kinds of tests, more accurately? One thing that I had Krista do actually is I had her take the test for me, right? We do this occasionally if we're into a couple different ones, like, the 16 personalities one for Myers-Briggs. And then there's a couple others such as strength finders. And so I've had her complete those for me before. And it's interesting to see what results she gets completing it for me versus the results that I get for myself.
Oh yeah. Have they been different?
Yeah. So, for Myers-Briggs, for instance, and I'd love to spend some time talking about the letters and the distinction between them with you. But I'm an ENFJ when I take the test, I'm an ENFJ. When I take the test, or when she takes the test for me, I'm an ENFP.
Okay.
She is an ISTJ. And that's, I 100% believe that. So the discrepancy is between the J and the P.
Yeah.
And I think maybe standing next to her, I'm definitely a P. But, I think if you were to ask like my friends, like when I was in college and I was living with a bunch of other guys, I definitely behaved like a J. For sure.
Yeah. I think what you're describing about projecting who you want to be when you're taking the test, or even having different results depending on when you take it or who's taking it, is really, really common. And speaking to what you just mentioned, the fact that she sees you as a P and you test as a J, which we can talk more about in a minute here. But anytime you're comparing yourself against somebody who's really strong in one of those letters, it can be easy to think, well, I'm not that strong, so I must be the opposite type.
Yeah.
And it's a continuum. So you may fall very close to the middle, where she may fall much further to one side, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you're actually on the other side. And in terms of projecting, I think going back to that idea that self-assessment is hard, I think these tests really are most useful if you actually spend some time thinking about them and exploring what they mean. Because just taking a test and moving on, you're gonna that's not really getting into it deeply enough to understand what it all means. But I think the more you explore these ideas and the more you understand about them, the more accurately you can test. And so a lot of people will test one way in the beginning, and then as they start to study it and learn a little bit more about it, they'll go back and take a closer look at all of those letters and realize where maybe one or two of them were off. But that's kind of a process. And sometimes often it can be a really humbling process, because like you said, you have a certain way that you would like to be, but that doesn't necessarily reflect what your natural tendencies are.
Yeah. And I think through that process, I mean, it can be humbling at times, but it also can be, I think, relieving, just to realize, okay, maybe this is why I act this way, for better or worse. And I know that for Krista was able to join us for the last 2 retreats, sort of. She wasn't there for all 4 of them, but and that was, that my one regret there was that we didn't get her signed up to go through that together, because I think those last 2 where she was starting to process this stuff too, and we could talk about it, made a huge difference in our marriage. And we even made some adjustments to how we work together. But before we get too far into that, I'd love to spend some time here on the Myers-Briggs test. And I know there's a ton other out there, and I do want to talk about a couple other fun ones with you as well. But can you give us just an overview of the Myers-Briggs test, and kind of like what the potential results could be?
Yeah, sure. So, and if anyone's looking for a good one to take, online tests aren't always the most accurate, and yet the 16personalities.com, which is the one that you just mentioned a minute ago, is a pretty good one. So that's a good starting place if someone hasn't ever heard of this before and is interested in finding out what their type might be.
And I feel like they have a lot of information too around the like what the results are too.
Right. Yeah. So that's a pretty good starting point. So with Myers-Briggs, when you take that test, your results will come back with a 4-letter kind of code for who you are. Actually, at 16personalities.com, they tack on a 5th letter at the end. They're the only ones that do that, and you don't really have to worry too much about that 5th letter. The 4 letters are the ones that are significant here. And the first letter will come back as either an I or an E, which is for introversion or extroversion. And those words are really familiar to people, I think, right now. However, what they mean may be less so. I think there's sort of this general idea that introversion has to do with not really liking people or being social, where extroversion has to do with always wanting to be sociable. And what it really comes down to isn't about being a people person or not, but where you're deriving your energy from. So an introvert and an extrovert can go to the same event or party and enjoy it just as much, but that event or party is going to be draining the battery of the introvert, where it's going to be filling up the battery of the extrovert. So when it's done, somebody who's introverted is going to want to go home and decompress and have some alone time, where the extrovert is going to be looking for the after party. So both people can enjoy social interactions possibly just as much as each other, but while it's filling one up, it's draining the other. So introverts get their energy from being alone, and extroverts get their energy from being with others.
So where do you score on that, E or I?
I'm an introvert, although I do fall a little closer to the middle on it, but definitely an introvert.
Yeah, and is it 16 personalities, if I remember correctly? They give you like a percentage,
yes,
from 0 to 100 essentially of where you fall within that letter. And I think that's super helpful too. And again,
I think so too.
Yeah, we're not there yet, but Krista's like 100% J.
Excited
to talk about that.
Yeah.
Yeah. And extrovert, I mean, even things like this, I mean, getting ready for this interview today, and I was just telling you, it's kind of, rainy weather. Like I said, the kind of weather where you just want to curl up on the couch all day. But Krista was like, you're going to get into those interviews and you're going to immediately, find some energy. And so I definitely think that E is the right letter for me. So I don't think there's any confusion there with whether I'm extrovert or not. So,
well, and this has some ramifications in the workplace in terms of those workplace interactions, because extroverts tend to be verbal processors and are pretty comfortable talking through their ideas even before they're entirely sure of themselves, where introverts prefer to work through everything in their own heads before piping up. And so when you have like group meetings and things like that, you may see a tendency for extroverts to kind of dominate the conversation. And that's a good thing to be aware of in those settings, is to maybe provide the opportunity for introverts to speak first, or to even allow some silences here and there, and create that opportunity.
For you and Todd's an E, right?
Yes.
Okay, so I don't know if you guys find this, but it's definitely true of me and Krista. And I tend to be more of the dreamer of the two of us. And so I'll just kind of spit things out. And like you said, part of it's just processing, part of it's just, I know a lot of it to her probably just sounds like nonsense, but part of it's just processing. And that can be overwhelming for her because she's thinking like, oh, when he says, like when he comes up with an idea, she immediately takes it as me pitching it.
Uh-huh.
Her. Whereas I might not be like necessarily pitching it. I'm just talking through it. And a lot of times by the time I get through it, I've realized this is a ridiculous idea. We're never going to do this. So that was it. I mean, that was eye-opening for us, just that she needs to sometimes let me, talk through the idea completely. And likewise for her, like you said, letting her get a word in about that stuff.
Yep.
Do you find that with Todd at all?
Oh yes. And actually, as we talk through each of these letters, he and I are opposite on every one of them. So we're able to really kind of speak to both sides of all of these. When it comes to the introversion, extroversion, he and I both test a little closer to the middle. So he's less extroverted than some, and I'm less introverted than some. So we're opposites on that one, but not actually too far apart in terms of our styles. But yes, we do have that same experience for sure.
Yeah. And I actually, when I met Todd for the first time, thought he was an I. And really, I got to know him through the same giant program that I got to know you at. But again, I think that just speaks to, both of you in purposefulness of speaking, like you guys really, I feel like, think through the things that you say. And I could probably take a lesson in that occasionally. So, but anyways, moving on to the next set of letters.
Yeah. So the next two are either going to be an S or an N. S is for sensing and N is for intuition. The I was taken with introversion. So it's intuition. That's the N. And that has to do, it's referred to as our perceiving function, and it has to do with how you take information in. And so sensors take information in through their five senses, and intuitives take information in, of course, through their senses also, but there's also sort of an element of a gut instinct that intuitives are using also. And so sensors are looking at what things are, and intuitives are looking at things and thinking about what could be. Sensors tend to focus a little more on where we've come from and place value on systems that are already in place, things that are already working, and intuitives are trying to think a little more outside of the box and move us forward. There's a little more innovation coming from intuitives, and there's a little more of holding on to tradition coming from sensors.
And so how does that play out in the workspace?
Yeah, so this is an interesting one because there's a discrepancy, a percentage discrepancy on this one. With the others, the population is divided pretty evenly, like introverts and extroverts are about 50-50 in the population. With sensing and intuition, 70% of people are sensors and only 30% are intuitives. And this is interesting because if you think about marketing, most marketing is really geared towards pointing towards the future and wanting to help people think outside of the box. But when you recognize that 70% of the population are sensors, that means there's a majority of people who are kind of comfortable with the way things are or the way things have been, or are maybe a little bit resistant to change. And so that comes, certainly there's the element of the interpersonal relationships in the workplace also, but I think this one is really interesting when it comes to thinking about branding and marketing, because you have to think about how it's going to reflect who you are, but then also the audience that you're trying to appeal to, and recognizing that sometimes as marketers with a product, you have to be helping people be willing to embrace that kind of change and not force it or make it feel scary,
Yeah. Do you find in the Showit office specifically that there's like, is the breakdown about 70-30? Do you find that there's more sensors than there are intuitives? Because I'm just thinking of like what the jobs that the programming,
right.
And I feel like Krista has that similar mind. She's definitely an S for sure. So how does that look in the Showit office?
Well, strangely, we actually just were looking at the statistic a couple of weeks ago, and we're flipped in the Showit office. We have a higher percentage of intuitives in the office than sensors, but that's really unusual. And we were kind of debating why that may be. I mean, it's possible that there are people in our office who have mistyped and are actually S's. That's possible. It's also possible that it's the industry that we're in, and it's drawn, people who love technology and are excited about where this software is headed, that we may be attracting people that are kind of out of the box thinkers. So it's flipped in our office. And I think you may see that in different industries also, but in the population at large, it's
that's
more
really interesting. I would think just having a bunch of programmers, and is there a discrepancy between male, female as far as the breakdown?
Not on this one.
Not on this one.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. The next one there is, yes.
What about money? I would think that somebody who's managing money is more of a S instead of an N.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep. In fact, the gal who takes care of that for us at Showit is also an ISTJ, like your wife.
And Krista takes care of it.
I think that's the perfect personality
to be
looking at budgets and things like that.
Yeah, because I'm getting sold on, the marketing that's being put in front of me all the time. And I have Krista to reel me in.
Yeah. So, well, and that's a great example of how to balance, because you've got, in your case, you have you that are, you're excited about possibilities and sort of moving forward. And she's the one who's wisely pulling the reins in at times, and you see that in a company also. I mean, you really need both. You need the out of the box thinkers and the ones who are making sure that everything's, wise.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. So moving on to the next letters. So we have E versus I. Hey friends, we're going to take a quick 60-second break so I can introduce you to one of my favorite companies and the sponsor of this episode, Showit. Showit is a drag and drop website building platform created especially for photographers and creative entrepreneurs. It's used by some of the biggest names in the creative industry, from Amy and Jordan Demos to Caitlin James, and it's what we built our website on too. What's awesome about Showit is that it's both powerful and easy to use. The intuitively designed website builder makes it easy to change colors, fonts, images, and objects. Finally, a website you can update on your own without having to hire a designer for every tiny change. It's Google friendly, and you can design the desktop and mobile versions of your website side by side to ensure your website looks great on any device. And you can even integrate a WordPress blog with your Showit website, making it that much more powerful. And guess what? They have tons of free and premium professionally designed website templates to help you get started. But what makes Showit such a special company is their customer support. They're super responsive and are there to help every step of the way. You can even save 10% on an annual subscription by using the code BTB show. For more information, check out the show notes. And now back to our episode. Yeah, for sure. Yeah. So moving on to the next letters. So we have E versus I, S versus N. Now we have F versus T.
That's right. And this is feeling versus thinking. And I don't like those words because it feels like for a feeler, if you're not a thinker, that makes it sound like you're not a thinker. Yeah. And that's not, it doesn't mean that feelers aren't capable of thinking, but feeling and thinking is called our judging function, and it has to do with how you make decisions. And so it really, in a nutshell, comes down to an ability to detach or not. And so a thinker can hold ideas off to the side of them, and people can shoot holes in that idea, and it doesn't impact them personally because that idea is held safely out to the side. So if you don't like their idea, it doesn't reflect poorly on them. It doesn't mean you don't like them. It just means you don't like the idea, and they're able to look objectively at that idea and decide whether or not to salvage it or to, ditch it and move on. And so thinkers are able to detach in terms of their own, like how things reflect on them personally, and they're also able to detach in terms of how things are going to affect others. Not that they don't take that into consideration, but their thought process is more logical, based more on data and statistics and logic. And so they're able to look at things a little more objectively. Meanwhile, feelers are much less detached. That's more of a difficulty for feelers. And so where the thinker has that idea safely out to the side of them, feelers hold it right in front of their heart. And so if you attack a feeler's idea, it feels to them as though you're attacking them, because they attach their ideas to their identity. And so in terms of how things reflect themselves, they are not detached, they're attached. And in terms of how things affect other people also, they may very well be logical in their thought processes also, but they are taking into account how other people are going to feel about a decision, how it's going to impact other people. They're much more aware of the personal impact, where thinkers are focused more on whether something actually makes sense.
So where do you fall on the last two?
So on that one, I'm a feeler, and that was a harder one. I would like to be a thinker.
Me too. Yeah, I would like to, because I think again that sums what you were saying about feelers holding ideas close to their heart.
Mm-hmm.
Definitely sums me up. I think I would love to be able to take things less personally.
Right, and I've grown in that. Like I can stay detached for much longer now than I used to be able to, but there always comes a point in any conversation that feels, touchy in some way, where I start to take things personally, and I try not to, but it's hard.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely hard. I think I probably score pretty high as far as a feeler goes.
Yeah.
And I always, sometimes I lament that to Krista. I wish that nurture. A lot of this is nature versus nurture.
Mm-hmm.
I wish I could nurture that T a little bit more. So,
right, I feel that too. And one way that people talk about all of these dichotomies, they're called, the two letters in each category, is comparing it to being right-handed or left-handed. And actually, I'm glad you just said nurture versus nature, because the theory behind Myers-Briggs is that this is part of our nature. We're born with it, just as we're born to be right-handed or left-handed. But our nurture affects quite a bit. And going back to the right-handed, left-handed thing, I will always be right-handed, but I can do things to strengthen my left hand. And so it's not that I'm all right-handed all the time. I'm not all feeler all the time. I can do things to strengthen that left hand, the thinking side, but it's not going to change the fact that I am a right-handed person.
Yeah, for sure. And for Krista and I mean, that's probably one of the biggest things I think we've had to work through working together on a daily basis. I mean, also just being married, right? Because even if we didn't work together, we're going to see each other often. But again, I mean, as an extrovert and as just kind of processing ideas verbally and throwing things out there, as I come across them or learn them or whatnot, or come up with them. Again, Krista is kind of, she'll start asking me questions about them, and she's just trying to she's vetting the idea essentially.
Mm-hmm.
She's wondering, okay, is this something we can actually implement or not? And I'll take that as, a personal attack. Like what, and part of it, again, it's just that distinction between her needing to give me a little bit of time to process that stuff verbally before piling on a million different questions about whether, that's a good idea or not. So that's been something that we've had to work through. Where do you fall on S versus N?
Oh, I'm an S.
Okay. So, ISF.
F. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So ISF so far. And then I am ENF so far. I think if there is one letter though that I wish I could change, it would be that one.
Yeah, F to a T.
I feel like I don't care as much about the other letters. That's the one I wish that I could switch a little bit. But oh well. Again, is there in the office? Is there what's the breakdown look like, and how do you? What are some of the ramifications for working with others who are the opposite of you?
Yeah. Again, in our office, the statistics are a little surprising. We have a higher number of Fs than I would anticipate, especially you had asked about gender breakdown. And on this one, thinking versus feeling, the population at large is divided 50-50, but 70% of women are feelers and only 30% are thinkers. And then it's switched for men. 70% of men are thinkers and 30% are feelers. And so we have a higher percentage of men in the Showit office. And so it's kind of surprising that we have a higher percentage of feelers also. And I'm not really sure why that is.
I would
But
assume it'd have to at least a little bit to do with the industry. I mean, I think the industry is predominantly women, and
yeah,
so it would make sense for, um, a company like Showit that does really well and serves that community really well, to be more in jive, I guess,
yeah,
with
yeah,
that kind of
absolutely.
like F.
Well, even if you look at our support team, I mean, they have to understand all the technology and stuff,
Yep.
and yet they're also a lot of it. That the majority of support is interpersonal. I mean, they're interacting with people all day, every day, and that F is able to sort of help create connections.
Yeah. So I'm
So,
sure that's a huge strength, for the team, or to a certain extent.
yeah,
Um,
yeah, yeah.
Also maybe hard for, I mean, I could imagine it also being a little hard for support too, taking ideas personally and things like that, especially if you have a frustrated, client or customer.
Right.
But moving on to now J versus P.
Yeah. To figure out what you are.
Yeah. So I am, like I said, I think, I mean, I test as a J.
Hmm.
Krista still to this day swears that I'm a P.
Uh-huh.
I'm not quite as organized as her, but if it were up to me to clean the house, I would do that once a week probably. Whereas
Okay.
Krista, before we had a Roomba, which is the greatest, I mean, it's the greatest invention of all time, because Krista, I mean, we have dogs too. So she would vacuum every single day.
Uh-huh.
Now we don't have to do that because we have the Roomba. But,
Awesome.
um, like, uh, I'm just happy like vacuuming once or twice a week, but she
Uh-huh.
would want to vacuum every single day. Like
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
I kind of know where everything is on my desk here, but it's not as necessarily clean,
Mhm.
as her desk is.
Yeah. Well, and so you're talking about your physical environment, which is a big part of this J versus P thing, and it's the way that it's most apparent.
Mm-hmm.
So J and P stand for judging and perceiving, and it has to do with how we order our worlds, whether or not we like things to be decided and structured, or whether we like things to be open, um, or there's more adaptability coming from P's and more structure coming from J's. And so we see that most in our environments. And so what you're describing about Krista loving for things to be tidy and clean, and I can super resonate with that. Except I have 4 boys,
Sure.
and it's getting harder and harder to keep things clean. But there's also an element of scheduling too. And so for some J's, they can let some things go in their environment as long as they kind of know what to expect in their days. Like if their
Mm-hmm.
day is scheduled, then maybe they're okay with a little clutter in their environment. And for P's, they may have a clean home, but they really want to stay adaptable in their schedules and reserve the right or the ability to be spontaneous. And so you'll see that both in scheduling and in environment, and it may show more in one way or the other.
Is there any gender difference here?
No, this is 50-50 across the board.
Yeah. And so, again, I think maybe it has to do with my environment too. In college, I was definitely the J of the group, the house being crazy drove me nuts. I would have a schedule every day, in terms of like when I did my studying, when I didn't, and when I was at class and so on and so forth. And then, living with Krista, maybe, I think part of it is just because I know, she's going to do certain things. And so maybe I personally let some of those things go.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that could be it as well. But I do think I stand firm against, Krista when she argues that I'm actually, but it's probably close. I probably test, pretty close to the middle there.
Well, and I would say on this one, I don't have a statistic to back this up, but it's my opinion that this one we see more changes with this one maybe than with any of the others, because like some people have a job that requires one or the other of them. Like maybe somebody is very much a P, but they work at a job that requires them to be very structured. And so they're operating as a J from 9 to 5 every day. Or maybe they're a J, but they have a job that's kind of always keeping them on their toes. And so they're operating as a P from 9 to 5. And I think if you see business partners working together, or in the case of a husband and wife, like what you just said, if you have 2 J's, one may relax a little bit to to take sort of more of the spontaneous role. Or if you have two Ps, one may become more structured because they realize that somebody has to be to keep life running smoothly. And so I think a lot of people spend a lot of time behaving maybe slightly out of their type on this one for one reason or another.
Yeah, and that makes total sense. And I think when we were going through that program together, there were a couple business partners there, and one, it seemed like all the time would be even if there were two Ps, let's say, one would be acting as the J just to keep the business, running and successful and moving forward. Really makes sense. So each of these four letters, so like for 16 personalities, for instance, we'll spit out like the campaigner or the protagonist. And I think is that made up by 16 personalities?
Yeah. Every website, every book who does these, they all come up with their own names.
Yeah. And then they can kind of give you the general gist of that specific personality type. And so we don't have time to talk about every single combination of each, but just to review. So you were ISFJ?
That's right.
Okay, cool. And what's Todd? Just out of
He's
curiosity.
ENTP.
ENTP. So across the board,
Opposites. Yep.
And pretty much the same for Krista and I. Krista being an ISTJ. J is the only similarity.
Yeah.
Even though it's contested. So, is there anything in particular that's come up in the Showit office? Like ramifications of working through this kind of stuff together.
Yeah, I mean, I know for a fact, because I've had conversations, like one-on-one conversations with a few people, where I know that this has been beneficial in terms of understanding coworkers and kind of creating some smoothness in communication, and even just understanding why they're so different in the way that they operate or the way they make decisions and think through things. And so I know that there's at least been some relational benefit to this.
Yeah. And I think that's huge, actually going through this stuff, because we can make assumptions about, one another. And that was one of the rules while we were at this leadership program, was don't assume somebody else's personality type, because you're often wrong, and, but actually sitting down and working through this stuff together, I think it opens you up to other people, and so other people can see more clearly both blind spots for themselves, but then also how they need to communicate or interact with the people around them. And for many of the people listening, they're probably not working within a team as big as Showit. But I know personally, just for Chris and I think even regardless of whether we were working together full time as a husband-wife team, that would have been, we would have benefited we're just from doing this for our own marriage.
Oh yeah.
So what are some other, there's a million other tests out there. First of all, I guess which ones are research backed, which ones are not? Because I have friends who are in the into the Enneagram. Okay, yeah, and I can never pronounce it, so I'm not even going to try to pronounce it again during the show. But for instance, that one, like which ones out there actually have some research, kind of backing up, their testing methods and results and so on.
Right.
Are there other ones?
Yeah. And I think that's kind of a debated concept out there, because I saw an article recently from a psychologist who was saying that Myers-Briggs just has no substantial psychological backing for it. But then you can read plenty of other things that will cite many studies. And I'm not a psychologist or a psychiatrist, so I don't, I'm not sure how they would describe one study over another as having more validity or not. But most people out there who are supporters of one of these methods for typing personality will say that they've got plenty of research to support it. And other people will say that it's garbage. So the Enneagram, for instance, has been around for at least a couple thousand years. And so it has a lot of history to it and a lot of anecdotal support, but I don't think it has a whole lot of research behind it, even though it's been around so long. Same with the four temperaments. That goes back to, what was it, the 5th century BC? Hippocrates was the one, the sanguine, choleric, phlegmatic, those 4 temperaments. So they've been around a really long time. But
And that's something that you become, that specific one is something you've become interested in recently, right?
the four temperaments.
Yep.
I actually haven't spent a lot of time looking at that one. I mean, it's a little more basic,
Mm-hmm.
I would say, and it's I've sort of been vaguely aware of it all along, but haven't spent a whole lot of time looking closely at it. I think the Strength Finders book and the Strength Finders program, they definitely have a lot of research and statistics. Again, maybe not psychological, but at least in terms of polling people and observing people, and they've got a lot of statistics backing the work that they're doing.
And I feel like for that test specifically, a lot of companies out there do that and provide that test for their employees. I know that Krista, when she first got out of college, she's working for a nonprofit, a big nonprofit, and they had everybody, take the Strength Finders and go through that. And so that's something that she's had me go through since. So which ones are your favorite?
Well, Myers-Briggs for sure.
Yep.
I like it because I feel like it explains a lot about who we are and how we operate, but still leaves lots of room for nuance. I mean, some try to get very much more specific and some try to stay much more vague. I feel like Myers-Briggs is specific enough to be useful without being so specific as to be confining. So you can have, I'm an ISFJ. You can have another ISFJ who's maybe a little more melancholy, or because those are certain things that other tests might try to add in as further identifiers. But Myers-Briggs sort of leaves room for those kinds of nuances within each personality type. So that's why I like it, and also the theory that it doesn't change, that it's part of how you're wired. I agree with that theory, that we're born with not as blank slates, but wired to be a particular way.
Sure.
So Myers-Briggs is for sure my favorite. I have enjoyed reading about the Enneagram recently. And there's different opinions about the Enneagram in terms of whether it pairs well with Myers-Briggs or not. I happen to think it's a useful supplement to Myers-Briggs. For instance, my oldest son, who's 13, is a very different personality type from me in terms of Myers-Briggs. He's an INTP. But I suspect that he and I are the same number on the Enneagram, which to me explains why he and I are similar in a lot of ways, even though our personalities are actually quite different.
And is there
so I think it's useful for that.
Can take this test online? Because I'm going to link to, there's somewhere that people can take the Enneagram. Did I say that right?
Yeah, I think I might have sent you a link to one of them. I don't feel like there are any excellent online Enneagram tests at this point. It's probably a little more helpful to just read about each of them and sort of self-assess. But that one that I sent you is a pretty decent one.
All right. So I'll include information about that for sure in the show notes so that people can get to that. And with that test, right, there's a main number and then there's like a wing or something like that?
So you have there's 9 numbers. You have your main number, and then they're written out in a circle, 1 through 9, and so every number has a number on either side of it. So I'm a 9. The number on either side for me is an 8 and a 1, and so for every number you lean one way or the other to sort of add some depth to so like as a 9, I don't lean towards the 8, I lean towards the 1. But then you also have other numbers that you go to in stress and other numbers that you go to in health, and it starts to get, kind of confusing if you're not paying close attention.
So you had mentioned that you and your son, you share different personality types, but you probably share the same number on the Enneagram.
Yes.
So how has that helped you maybe relate better to your son or understand him a little bit more?
Yeah. Well, so I said that he's an INTP, and INTPs are known for being much more introverted than some. They tend to be the most introverted of the introverts. Very analytical. They're observers. They're scientist types, or that's sort of the stereotype about them. And he is analytical. He is all of those things. But he also has a very good sense for how other people are feeling. He's very compassionate. And INTPs aren't necessarily always the most relational of the personality types. And I wouldn't say that he's super duper relational, but he definitely just has a lot of empathy. And I'm a 9 on the Enneagram, which is a peacemaker. And if he's a 9 also, which I think that he is, that would kind of make sense that as a peacemaker, as a 9 on the Enneagram, he would sort of use that analytical side to be observing people and wanting to create peace between people. So his analysis of things, his logic, isn't necessarily geared towards, scientific things or
Sure.
projects like that, but maybe geared a little more towards people.
And that's interesting because I think, again, just talking about how some of these other tests can round out the Myers-Briggs test, for instance, like that might be an insight that you skip over or don't realize just going off of the Myers-Briggs test where, the stereotype for his personality is more of a scientific, which when you describe that personality type, it doesn't exactly scream empathy,
Right.
but it turns out he has, a ton of it. So as far as personality types go, maybe it's because Myers-Briggs is just everywhere. It just seems to be like one of those things that's been developed, at least, at least in modern times, and with, modern research and so on and so forth. If you started there and you really wanted to learn a little bit more about yourself, and the practical and whatever practical implications are, which personality test would you recommend?
After taking Myers-Briggs?
Yep.
Probably Strength Finders or Enneagram.
Okay. And what about Chrono Types?
Well, that one's new for me. I just came across it recently, and I think it's really interesting, but I don't have a whole lot of insight to add to it. But yeah, Chrono Types has to do, chrono, that's time. It has to do with when you're at your best and when you're at your worst. And there's a fun quiz online called the Power of One quiz. And it lets you know what your sleep schedule is like, whether you're someone who is up early in the morning, raring to go, or somebody who likes to stay up late and get things done into the wee hours, or somebody who needs a lot of sleep or has fitful sleep. So it starts with how you sleep and then kind of builds out a schedule of your day based on what your sleep style is like. So the best times of day to have coffee, or the best times of day to schedule meetings, or the best times of day to exercise based on what your chronotype is.
Yeah, I think that stuff especially has been fascinating. And I learning about my personality and Chris's personality and how to work together was a huge eye opener. But lately we've been talking a little bit more about that. Daniel Pink wrote a great book that's fairly new called When, the Science of Time. I think that's the subtitle. I'll link to it in the show notes.
Mm-hmm.
But he talks a little bit about chronotypes, and he talks about it in terms of being a lark or an owl. And
Okay.
he has a test that he links to, and it's a little bit different. The one I like the one that you link to because I feel like maybe it's a little bit more developed, and you get each result is named after an animal, which I thought was super fun. But I think it's just eye opening in terms of like actually scheduling your day, and for somebody who runs their own business, so
Yes.
if you're working for yourself, I think it'd be especially valuable because, like you can set up your day so that when you're most productive is when you're doing your, biggest and hardest tasks for the day. So I found that one, super interesting in particular, especially for somebody who runs their own business and sets their own schedule.
Yes, absolutely.
Do you remember your result for that one?
I'm lion.
And what is it? Do you remember like kind of the background around being a lion?
Well, so in terms of the sleep schedule, it is one who tends to be up earlier in the morning, and then goes to bed a little bit earlier at night, which is accurate. Now he was sharing, the guy who developed that quiz in that book, he was sharing some observations as a sleep therapist that he had gained from talking to sleep patients over the years. And for people who are lions, they also have a tendency to be sort of type A go-getter types. And the way he described it was in extreme enough terms that I didn't feel like I really fell into that category.
Sure.
And yet the way he broke down the daily schedule I definitely related to as I looked at where he had placed things in the day for lion types. It all definitely made sense. And so the way he extrapolated personality from that didn't strike quite as close to home for me, but the actual scheduling component of it did.
Yeah, I think the same was pretty much true of me. I think I identified less with like kind of the anecdotal stuff that he included around the results, and more with the daily schedule and when's best. I even came across an article, and my result was a bear, and he had put together for the person who was writing this article, who was also a bear, an ideal schedule for her, so it was interesting reading through that article and seeing what he recommended, the activities that you do at certain times during the day. And that was something that I really identified with. But I think that, what's interesting about going kind of down the rabbit hole of personality types is, even as you come across maybe something like the Enneagram, which, who knows how much like scientific evidence necessarily research backs up kind of the results that you see. I think there's still value in kind of processing this stuff, just becoming a little bit more self-aware, so that you can, understand your own blind spots and relate to others better.
Yes. There's a book about the Enneagram called The Road Back to You by Ian Cron and Suzanne Stabile. And in the introduction to that, Ian Cron was saying, he was sort of defending the Enneagram against those who would say it doesn't have enough scientific backing. And he said that his concern isn't so much about whether it's all been scientifically validated, so much as whether it's useful. And he believes very strongly that it's useful. And so he wants to keep sharing about it and helping people with it.
Yeah, that makes sense, especially for something that's been around for as long as it's been around. If it wasn't useful, it wouldn't have stood the test of time, for sure.
Right.
All right. So one of my favorite extensions of the Myers-Briggs test, and it was one of my favorite parts of the leadership program, and this is their language, I think, right? Giants language. It's the 5 voices, and the 5 voices are, let me see if I can remember these: pioneer, creative, connector, nurturer, and guardian.
Yep.
And so depending on what your personality type is, generally one of those 5 voices correspond with your personality type. But like I said, there's, and like you mentioned earlier, it's like being right-handed and left-handed. You probably have all 5 voices, but a couple of them are more dominant than the others. And again, just one of those things, and this is a book that you can go check out. Krista being a guardian, somebody that stereotypically tends to be a little bit better with money, ask those questions, so when I come up with ideas, she's going to ask those questions and kind of vet that out before ever like really committing to it and before she gets excited about it. Whereas I tend to be a pioneer, and for better or worse, sometimes tend to be the loudest voice in the room, and kind of always pushing us forward.
Yeah.
So where would you fall on those 5 voices?
Yeah, so I am a nurturer. That's my first one, and guardian is second for me. And they base that around what your middle 2 letters are of your Myers-Briggs personality type, which, as a side note, is my favorite way to sort of group personality types together. There's some different theories on the best way to kind of group them together, but I think personalities that share the middle 2 letters tend to be the most similar to each other. Not always, of course, but you definitely see some patterns there. And so generally speaking, other people with SF in the middle are nurturers like me. It may depend what's second, but in my case, guardian is second. So nurturing is caring for people and making sure that people and relationships are running smoothly. Guardian is making sure that systems are running smoothly.
Yeah, and that makes sense that Krista then would be a guardian. She's a ST, but her second one is nurturer. And it's funny. I think she's actually kind of surprised getting that. But it didn't surprise me at all. I mean, she's always, just in different ways. Maybe a different way than the stereotypical way of just looking out for somebody. But if somebody tells her, if we're hosting somebody, she can remember things in conversations, years before that they mentioned, and she'll account for those things, whether it be like a food allergy or like, oh, I remember they really liked this meal, things that I would just have never remembered. But yeah, so this stuff is all super interesting. Now, if we wanted to learn more and explore more of this kind of stuff, where should we go?
You can check out signsoflife.com or Signs of Life on iTunes. And like you said earlier, it's SINES, Signs of Life, which is sort of an inside personality joke, the way we came up with that title. But we talk all about personality there, and we will frequently reference other resources as well on our podcast. But yeah, my friend Jen and I, we just explore personality and the ramifications of understanding who you are and how you're wired.
And something else that people should visit is elisajoyful.com for sure. You also are a very talented writer, and even and a lot of things that you write about wouldn't necessarily be things that I am like by nature drawn to. You know, a lot of what you write about is motherhood and being and fostering.
Yeah.
You know, different anecdotes there, but I really enjoy it. So I just, again, speaks to, I think, you know, how I think about you as a writer. So people should totally check out elisajoyful.com. And I will also link to, you know, the other places that people can find you.
Great. Well, thank you.
All right. Well, thanks for tuning into the Brands That Book Show. To stay up to date with the latest episodes, make sure you hit the subscribe button.